If you're in New Orleans, things got a little bumpy today. This is Alan with Quarter Horse Arms. Today is January 6, 2023. It's an auspicious day for two reasons. First, this is the second anniversary of the insurrection at the Capitol following President Biden's election. And two, it's the day one of the U.S. Circuit Courts overturned the bump stock ban. But we'll come back to that. So, for those of you that don't know, a bump stock essentially replaces the stock of your typically AR and sometimes AK platforms. It has an attachment on it that goes, attaches to the trigger essentially. And there's a lot of different ways it did it. There were, several different manufacturers. And the way it worked was, just like any other semi-automatic weapon, you pull the trigger, the gun goes bang. What the bump stock did was it used the recoil energy, meaning as the gun kicked back into your shoulder, it used that energy to push the trigger forward. So it's resetting the trigger. And if your finger is still pulling the trigger back, as soon as it resets, you're firing it again and again and again. But each time you shoot, the trigger does a reset, meaning it goes back to the, you've got to pull me again to make the gun go bang. In the case of a machine gun, you just pull the trigger down and hold it, and it will fire until A, you let go of the trigger, or B, you're out of ammunition. So very different operations. So, and the other part with the thing with the bump stocks is most of them weren't that great. People put them on, they played with them, they took them off, and you've got to keep in mind that when you fire rapidly, a couple of rounds are going to go where you aim them, but for most people, after the first few rounds, the best you can say about aiming is they went that way, in the direction where the gun barrel was pointing. So you're going to go, why would you want them? Well, like I said, it was a gadget. They cost, $200-300 at the time. They wore out, they broke, whatever, it was a gimmick. And then what happened on, I forgot the date, but in 2017, it might have been October, well, I guess that date doesn't matter. In 2017, a gunman in Las Vegas went into a hotel, had a boatload of guns, and opened fire into the crowded streets in Las Vegas and killed literally dozens of people. And he was armed with weapons that had bump stocks or had at least one bump stock equipped firearm. President Trump, following that massacre, put a ban on bump stocks. Understandably, on the one hand, you have to look like you're doing something. And the other hand was, most people can't get that rate of fire without using a machine gun. So if you're firing into a crowded street, accuracy doesn't necessarily need to be that important. Because you fire enough times, you're eventually going to hit somebody. And that's, in fact, what this guy did. So the ban goes into effect. Department of Justice, which, owns the ATF, says we need to change the law. So they declared bump stocks as being machine guns. And they told people that if you had them, you had to turn them in. Or you could destroy them and turn them in. And, on my website, I put down, if you don't want to deal with it, just bring them to me and I'll take care of it for you. And, since I got absolutely no bump stocks dropped off for me to bring to the ATF, I'm going to assume everybody brought their own bump stock to the ATF. And, I guess if you believe that, I'll find some swampland for you to buy. So one of the things that happened at this point is the ATF is now declaring property item of yours, meaning the bump stock, to be illegal, and you have to turn them in and get rid of them. What about the money you paid for that thing? A lot of people objected to that because in a lot of previous things, if they were going to take something away, they gave you some kind of compensation. This isn't happening. So, in Massachusetts many years ago when they were banning handguns, there were weapon buybacks. And they've done this in other countries. I think Australia did some buybacks to get guns out of people's houses. But they were going to take the property, but they were giving you compensation for it. But not in this case. So, understandably, there are people going, this is my property. And it was legal when I bought it. Who the hell are you to tell me what I can do? Well, they did. And that kind of created, a problem. So the bump stock ban was challenged in several of the circuit courts, including the Fifth. So the courts don't normally hear cases that other courts have ruled on. And I'm talking about like the Ninth Circuit Court will not overrule the Second Circuit Court. I mean, that's kind of like, you hitting yourself in the face during a boxing match. You can do it, but you probably don't want to. So in the meantime, the circuit courts have all thrown out these cases, and they were all based on Second Amendment issues. And they all attacked the Second Amendment from a couple of different directions. So what they were saying was this was a violation of my right to keep and bear arms. And in some way, shape, or form, I think it was at least 3 of the circuit courts said, nope, sorry, you're out of luck. The ban stays in effect. But why now? Well, this time around, there was a guy in Texas who brought a lawsuit that to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and he said that this is not a machine gun, and I can prove it to you. And his explanation was pretty slick, and he used the ATF's own definitions against them. If you recall, I said a machine gun by the ATF, or as defined by the ATF, is any weapon that when you pull the trigger, more than one round fires. A semi-automatic is for every pull of the trigger, 1 round fires. So he's going, I'm pulling the trigger multiple times. The trigger is resetting each time between the shots. So the judges, I guess, were going, he's got a point. And so they're talking about not going at Second Amendment. They're going after statutory law. They're going after the statutes that the ATF set up. They used their own definition against them. And what happens is, I guess I'm going to try and... Sorry about that. I had to fumble over words. But what happened when the court heard this, and as a by the way, the Department of Justice's attorney said, well, it really is a machine gun because your finger's just sitting on the trigger. Go figure. Didn't win real well. Okay, so what he said was, we're talking about they've challenged the mechanics, they've challenged the law, and what they also said in one of the decisions was something to the effect of, if the terminology is ambiguous, or if the law itself is ambiguous, Congress needs to fix it. Not the ATF, but Congress. And so, while it might not be a machine gun, generally, under some of the policies or laws that the circuit courts use, the defendant automatically wins by default if the government can't prove the statute unambiguously criminalized the defendant's conduct. All right, essentially what that means is you have to prove that somebody's doing something criminal, and the law that defines that has to be unambiguous, meaning not subject to challenge. And I think I may have explained that weirdly, but basically, sum and substances, if they want to fix it, Congress has to fix the law. End of statement. Now, whether or not that will actually happen, I don't know. Where does it go next? Does everyone go run out and dig their bump stocks out of wherever they've stored them for safekeeping? I wouldn't be so quick to do that yet. My guess, and this is pure conjecture, is that this is going to wind up in the Supreme Court. And since you're no longer challenging it on constitutional grounds, meaning Second Amendment, you're challenging it based on definition and how clearly the law is written. And if you're going to follow the letter of the law, and in this case meaning one pull of the trigger, one bang, the answer is, my guess is the Supreme Court could say, you're right. When you're right, you're right. Now, to put this in a timeline, I think the guy brought this lawsuit into the Fifth Circuit Court in September of 2022. So we're talking 4 months for them to come to a decision. And so, it's just like the other courts. You have a majority rule with the judges. You have a majority opinion and a minority opinion. So basically what they were saying is you can't make somebody a criminal using ambiguous laws. You can't ban bump stocks because of your interpretation, meaning the ATF's interpretation. So I don't know who this guy was that brought the lawsuit. I don't know who his attorney or attorneys were, but my hats are off to them because these guys were slick. No longer was the bump stock a constitutional issue, it was a statutory issue, which is kind of neat. But at any rate, that's kind of what happened today, and I'm going to assume that this has not ended yet. This may just be the beginning of another round of lawsuits. And here's, the other question, and I don't have an answer, and I wish I had an attorney on call right now where I could say, hey, if the Fifth Circuit Court, which is representing the United States, says this ban is done, and it's done because it does not meet the letter of the law that the ATF spelled out in their ban, can a state then ban the item anyway? Or do the states have to follow pure federal law? It's an interesting question. And I thought this was worth doing kind of a very quick podcast. Not so much because it's bump stocks and I love bump stocks. I don't. It's important because for the first time, nobody went Second Amendment. No one's raising, hell over the fact that this is our right to keep and bear arms. The other and final part of this is whether or not the circuit court judges do what's called an en banc, or en banc if you don't like my accent. And this is where judges who have the ability are basically going to